Hi everyone, back with the last revision video for 2019. This is paper 3 preparation. I've had a bunch of emails asking me to do this one. So here it is. Obviously this one has to be different because there's a new pre-release for 2019, whereas for the other papers you can use the same videos as last year. Just to start off, I'd like to apologise if you pick up any manufacturing going on outside my window. We've got, as I mentioned in my exam technique video, we've got a new school being built right outside my window, and so there's a lot of drilling and stuff going on, and I don't know how good my microphone is, so I don't know how much that picks up. Similarly, there's some students outside, so they'll be getting on with some stuff as well. So you might hear a couple of noises in the background, but hopefully it'll all still be clear. First things first, the obvious difference between paper 3 and paper 1 and paper 2. There's two main differences. The main one is that it's based on a pre-release, so there's actually a context that all of the questions are going to be based around anyway. But also importantly, there's a little bit of a difference in terms of the structure. So in the past two exams that you'll have already done, by the time you're watching this video, you will have done two 4 markers, a 10 marker, a 12 marker, and a 20 marker. And that will be the same for both section A and section B. But with this one, we've got an 8 marker instead of the 4 markers. So instead of 4 markers over the total of the paper, you've got two 8-mark essay questions. So it's a little bit more challenging in terms of timing because you're having to do 8 essays rather than having to do 6 essays and a couple of calculations and short answer questions. So it's really important that you get your timing right, and that would be my first bit of advice. My advice is always to split the paper into two sections in 2 hours. I would try and stick to one section in each hour and think of it as two separate papers. So you've got section A based on the section A case studies, and you've got the 4 essays based on those, and then the second hour, or maybe an hour and 15 if you get any extra time or any other access arrangements. Be careful with this kind of thing. My advice is always to take a watch into the exam, and if you know what time your exam is going to start, you can think about what time it should be when you're moving on to each question. If you're starting at quarter past, or if you're starting at 8:45, then you should know by 9:45 you need to have finished that first section, and then you can divide that further into the different mark questions. If you work at a mark a minute, then that gives you 10 minutes spare in each section, which you'll most likely need for the 10 and 12 markers, but it also gives you that time to read through the case studies and maybe do a little bit of a plan for each question as well. I don't get my students to write out bullet point plans, anything more than just a couple of little notes maybe, but if that's something that you've been taught and you find comfortable and you're comfortable with timing wise, then feel free to do that as well. 2 sets of extract, 1 for each section. Consider how you'll approach the case studies. Some people will prefer to read the case study first and then look at the questions. My preference is that you read the questions first, because then you have an idea of what you're going to be asked about when you're reading the case studies, and it'll help you identify which extracts or which sections of an extract are likely to be linked to each question in that section. So my advice would be, don't go between section A and section B at all. That first hour, just look at section A. Read the questions for section A and then look at the section A case study. Don't look at section B, even though there's going to be a little bit of a link because these are based on the same context. You don't want to confuse yourself by giving yourself too much information, too much input from those extracts. I would just look at the section B extracts when you get up to section B. As I've mentioned already, the obvious difference between paper 3 and the other two papers is there's no 4 markers, but instead you have an 8 marker. I'm not going to go through this any further now because there's an exam technique video on my channel already. I'm going to try and do that thing where you add in a little bit of a link so you can click on that directly. I'm trying to step my YouTube game up. If you want to click, and if you want a bit of exam technique information, I would have a look at that video. That'll cover what is required in an 8 marker and how an 8 marker is different to a 10 marker and a 12 marker. So the first part that's important is that there's a pre-release case study. This is it. You should have all seen this. Your teacher should have shown you it. It's also available on the Edexcel website. The context for this year is the market for holidays in the UK and abroad, and the UK businesses operating in these markets. So it says, to prepare for this year's context, you should research the following 4 bullet points. These are the 4 bullet points that I'm going to go through. You can't take any of your research or investigation data into the exam. And actually, the key thing that they're stressing, and they've stressed since the first year, is you don't actually need to do any research. I haven't given my students a huge amount to do. We've used the market as an example in some lessons, and I've got them to do little bits and pieces, especially when we did things like Porter's 5 forces, because the airline industry is a really good example for Porter's 5 forces. But I haven't got them to do a huge amount because realistically they don't need to, because you're going to get extracts. You're going to get 6 or 7 or 8 extracts in the exam paper, And realistically, that's the most important thing. The most important thing isn't that you've done loads of research on your own and you can bring in these statistics. You're not expected to be able to do that. The most important thing is that you can use the case studies effectively. So you could go into the exam without having done any research on the holiday market, and you would still have just as much of a chance of getting a good grade, providing you use the case study effectively. There is obviously a benefit of knowing a little bit of background information, and that's pretty much what I'm going for here. I'm not trying to give you tons and tons of information on loads of different businesses within the market. I'm probably going to only mention a couple of businesses anyway. And I'm only going to go into two in any sort of detail. I'm just going to give you some background information about the market and a little bit about some of the potential trends that you might see. So we've got our 4 bullet points. We've got UK consumer trends over the last 10 years, such as activity holidays, staycations, city breaks and package holidays. We've got influences on UK-based consumers for holidays, such as the growth and development of emerging economies, social trends, changing costs and prices and external factors. There's quite a lot of a link between that first bullet point and that second bullet point, especially when it comes to social trends. I don't really mention a huge amount in here about social trends because I think that's covered in the consumer trends. Some major businesses and niche operators in the holiday market, including budget airlines. I've looked at 2 examples of airlines that have been really prominent in the news over the last few years, but that's it. Again, if you're going to see any businesses that you're going to have to mention in your answers, they're going to be given to you in the case study. And so as a result, you don't need to know everything about every single business in these markets. And the last one is the competitive environment facing UK holiday businesses. You've got the focus for this video, which is the research theme bullet points. I've split those into a couple of different things. I'm only going to look at a couple of things for each bullet point. I don't want to overload you with too much information because there's no expectation that you memorize this stuff. I just think it's important and helpful to have a little bit of background information in there. So the first thing we're going to have a look at is consumer trends in the last 10 years. And a lot of the information that I'm going to give you, it comes from the ABTA, which is the Association of British Travel Agents. So they do this report each year, and this is the 2018 Holiday Habits Report. There's a link there as well. I can try and make that a clickable link if possible. Effectively, what their role is to try and raise standards in the industry, give guidance on issues from sustainability to health and safety, try and provide some financial protection schemes, and stuff like that. So they're more neutral than any information you might get from the business, one of the companies themselves. So there's quite a lot of information on trends that all came from this report. I've picked out what I think are the key parts. So the first thing we're going to have a look at is types of holiday and popularity. 85% of people surveyed, all of this stuff is done by surveys of course, so it's not going to be the perfect sample size, and it's not going to be asking everyone, but they've asked a representative example of people, and so this is what you get from a survey. 85% of people asked took a holiday, either domestic or foreign last year. 60% of these people took 60% of people in general took a foreign holiday. Though of these foreign holidays, many more were 7-day breaks rather than 14-day breaks. So they reckon that 14-day breaks, the 2-week holidays, are 20% less popular than 20 years ago. Meanwhile, the 7-day breaks are twice as popular as 20 years ago. So this might be cost driven. It might be because the cost of holidays have gone down. It might be because incomes haven't risen at the same amount. Either way, people are tending to go on shorter breaks as a trend, 7-day holidays, especially foreign holidays, rather than 14-day holidays, which were popular 20 years ago. And of the foreign holidays, package holidays are still growing in popularity. So a package holiday is one where flights, accommodation, transfers, and sometimes the activities that you do on the holiday are all included in one price and sold together. So there's a lot of businesses that, a lot of travel agents, a lot of the sort of brick and mortar travel agents that you'd see on the high street, they offer these package holidays. And the idea is they're popular for 2 reasons. Consumers care about value for money, and they believe that buying all of these things at once is cheaper than buying them individually. They also like the fact that everything's done for them. So there's a huge trend towards convenience, not just in travel, but in every market. Huge trend towards convenience. People are inherently lazy. They don't want to do a huge amount of work. It's one of the main reasons why online shopping's become so popular, and e-commerce is in general grown in the travel market and in other markets. People like having everything done for them, and if you can just go on one website or you can go into one travel agent and you can book one holiday that covers everything, that is a lot easier than having to do the whole shop around and so on. In terms of the types of holiday, city breaks are the most popular type of holiday. 48% of people took a city break last year. Obviously that's going to be primarily down to convenience and decreased costs, but there is also a trend towards the increased popularity of city breaks. And we'll come into that in a little bit more detail. As you can see from that graphic, which is from that ABTA report, 48% took a city break, 40% a beach holiday. You've got countryside breaks, a sightseeing trip, all-inclusive holidays, and then there's a lot of other options as well. Those are the types of holidays and the ones that are the most popular. Instagram has had a pretty big impact on these city break trends. So one study showed that 40% of millennial travellers thought that one of the most important factors in their choice of holiday was how Instagrammable the holiday would be. So I did a little bit of research. When I wrote this presentation last week, I went on Instagram myself and I searched the hashtag Eiffel Tower. There were 5.6 million posts on Instagram that included Eiffel Tower, and the majority of them are tourist shots, and a lot of them are attractive people posing unnaturally in front of the Eiffel Tower. That little trend that teenagers seem to have, where they'll take 3 photos where they're standing in the exact same position but maybe looking in different directions and then post all 3. That's obviously really important. A lot of people feel that their holiday is determined by what quality Instagram post that they get. Lake Wenaka, which is posted on the right, there's a picture of that on the right, they deliberately started targeting influencers with their tourism strategy. They targeted people who were quite influential on Instagram, and as a result, over the last 4 years, their tourism has increased by 15% year on year, which was significantly higher than their increases in tourism before that. So it does work. And then I don't think I've ever referenced a Drake song on a YouTube video before, but my students will know I've tried and reference culture as much as I possibly can. There's that verse in the song Emotions from his latest album that talks about that person he knew who had that goal of visiting Rome, but then when they got there, all they really wanted to do was impress the people at home. So posting good pictures of Rome on Instagram, because that was more important to them than actually them enjoying their holiday. And he says another bit about how he's got another friend, or he knows someone else who saves up photos from their holidays to post more regularly throughout the year so that people feel like they're on holiday. So it sounds ridiculous, but it is really, really important. I'm guilty of that myself. I'm only 30, and so I still consider myself as fairly young. And whenever I go on holiday, it's you see those things, and rather than just admire the scenery for what it is, you think, this would look pretty nice on Instagram. Will this get me to over 10 likes, which is pretty much my benchmark for a successful Instagram post. Who are people booking with is another consumer trend that people have to be aware of, and it's just important to have a look at the growth of online services, and also whether people still value the sort of travel agents and the in-person communication. For foreign holidays, people much prefer using experts. There's obviously a risk when you book a holiday that you don't know what's out there potentially, you don't know what the best option is. And a study showed that only 7% of people who had engaged with a travel professional then went away and booked independently. So what that means, what that suggests to me is that if a business can engage with a consumer, it's likely to lead to a sale. It's that engaging with the consumer part that's the difficult bit, especially online, because there's obviously a lot more competition, so consumers have got a lot more choice. If someone goes into a branch, what they tend to do, according to this study, is they tend to book with that branch. So it seems like people value the expert advice, especially on foreign holidays where there's a little bit more risk involved and a little bit more uncertainty and a little bit of a lack of knowledge of the market for the consumer. So there's a graph on the right that comes from the APTA report that talks about for UK holidays and for holidays abroad, the differences in terms of how many people book in travel agents. You can see there that third one down, 40% of foreign holidays book with a travel agent, whereas that's only 20% for holidays within the UK. Maybe that's a confidence issue in terms of people feeling like they know what they're gonna get into. A Statista report in 2017 showed a little bit of information about spending on foreign holidays and domestic holidays. So UK outbound holiday expenditure in 2017 was 31.2 million. Domestic holiday expenditure was only 14.1 billion. That's obviously going to be lower, despite the fact that there's more demand, because it's obviously significantly cheaper to travel domestically than it is to travel internationally. You can see there that number of holidays abroad from the UK in 2017 was 46.6 million. That's fairly consistent. It's actually growing a little bit, despite what you might think about the economy and wealth and income. Incomes in the UK have dropped over the last sort of 6 or 7 years. Despite that, holidays are still really popular. So if you use these rounded figures, it is flawed data, but it's a measure. The average foreign holiday expenditure would be at about £670 So that might explain why, obviously, a domestic holiday, especially one, the average domestic holiday length is only 3.5 days. So it's more like those long weekends. It's obviously a lot cheaper to go on a 3.5 day or 3 or 4 day domestic holiday than it is to go for a 7-day or a 14-day holiday abroad. So that might explain why the foreign market is double the size in terms of value than the domestic holiday. So the next bullet point that we're going to have a look at is trends on UK-based consumers and influences on UK-based consumers. So one thing I want to have a look at first and foremost is emerging economies demand increasing. So emerging economy is an economy with a high growth rate. They're not a developed economy, so infrastructure is still developing, but they are leading the growing demand for international tourism, and a lot of people are going to these emerging economies, partly due to the fact that these emerging economies are targeting their inbound tourism as a real source of income. A really good example of this is Rwanda. So Rwanda's president received a World Tourism Award for leadership for their government's work to develop tourism in a sustainable way. Their tourism industry contributes 12.7% of their GDP and over 130,000 jobs. Rwanda is one of the poorest countries in the world, so inbound tourism for them is hugely important. One of the things that they've done to try and increase their profile and make themselves more attractive as a destination is one of their promotional tactics has been a £30 million sponsorship deal with Arsenal. So this was announced in the same week as a 20% increase was announced in UK visitors to Rwanda. So you've got a picture there of Lacazette with a Visit Rwanda advertisement on his sleeve. There was a lot of criticism about that because obviously it is such a poor country and people might feel that that money should have been invested into improving infrastructure and improving standards of living. Their justification for that was that £30 million of sponsorship money had come directly from tourism, and so as a result it was the tourism industry contributing to its own growth rather than money that could have been spent elsewhere. So as you can see, a lot of these emerging economies are looking to the developed economies and trying to make themselves as attractive tourism destinations. So that's not just the case in Rwanda. Obviously a lot of Africa is focusing on that, but all over the world as well. We've already covered quite a bit about social trends, so I'm not going to go through this in a huge amount of information, but I did find an interview in The Independent from AITO, which is the Specialist Travel Association Executive Director, Kate Kenwood. She said that based on their research and their findings, people want more holidays. 11% of people surveyed said they wanted more holidays. However, people will likely spend slightly less on holidays this year, roughly 7% less. So that talks a little bit more towards the changes in income and people's spending power. And they also said that in terms of trends, beach breaks are moving down the wish list behind city breaks, walking and wildlife holidays that are becoming a little bit more popular. We've already mentioned that city breaks are immensely popular. I'll put a link at the bottom there to that article again. I'll try and make that clickable. It mentions in the bullet points the impact of fuel costs and the impact that has on pricing, so it's worth mentioning this as well. What I would say is if you're going to get a question about fuel costs, I would expect to see some information in the case study, so don't think that you need to recognise specifics, but the concept of how fuel costs has an impact on pricing might be useful if it helps you make your point between what you read in the case study and what point you want to make in your answer. So the global airline industry's fuel bill is estimated to be roughly 142 billion in 2018, which is about 23.5% of their operating expenses. So it is one of the most significant costs for an airline, is their fuel bill. And as a result, they are susceptible to increases and decreases in the price of crude oil. So there's an increase in price of over 20% on 2017, so the price of oil has significantly increased, and it's nearly doubled the global fuel bill for 2005. So this is forecast to rise again to over 160 billion in 2019. So oil prices are rising. Now, this has a huge impact on businesses because it affects the amount of profit that they make on each flight. They will try and avoid changing their price every time the fuel costs change because fuel costs do fluctuate. But it is going to have an impact on their profitability. And a really good example of this is EasyJet. So EasyJet's share value slipped in value in 2018 following warnings that fuel costs would rise again. So their fuel cost for the year was an estimated 1.2 billion. This is mainly due to the increase in prices of crude oil, which, as I said, had risen in about 16% in the last 4 months of 2018. There's a little graph there on the right talking about the price in dollars of crude oil. Obviously you can see there that there was a drop for 2016, but it's steadily rising. There was a little bit of a drop at the start of 2019, but it is rising again. So businesses are really highly impacted by changes in fuel costs, and so you might see something in the case study that shows an example of how fuel costs have increased. I know that I know Tutor to You do some sample papers for paper 3, and I know that one of the case studies that they had in one of theirs was about fuel costs, and it was a graph similar, and it was about the impact that the change in fuel costs would have on a business. I think it might have been British Airways or something like that. That's the kind of the thing you might get asked. So don't feel like you need to remember statistics, but just be aware that fuel costs are rising and have risen considerably and are expected to rise again, and that this will have an impact on potentially their selling price for their flights, but it certainly has an impact on their profit margins. And so as a result, they've got to be paying a lot of attention to this and make sure that they're ready to adapt. Another thing that's worth mentioning is the economic factors. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on the European Union. Again, if you get an economic factor, that might be something like income, for example, or exchange rates. You would likely expect to see that mentioned in the case study. So don't feel like you need to remember key statistics or anything like that. But here's a couple of points that I think might be worth knowing the little background to. Border-free travel is obviously really important. 76% of foreign holidays from the UK consumers are to EU countries. This is partly due to geographical proximity. It's obviously cheaper to fly to somewhere that's a little bit closer to you, but it's also due to ease. There's no borders within the European Union, which means it's simple for you to get in and get out of these countries when you're holidaying within EU countries. That's potentially likely to change if and when the UK leaves the European Union. The other thing that's important is the exchange rate. So this has a significant impact on the spending power of consumers. So one of the more immediate consequences of Brexit was there was a sharp fall in the value of the pound. It's due to mainly uncertainty. The chart on the right shows that. So you can see that 2016 we're at about 1.4 euros to the pound. As you can see, that's dropped quite considerably in 2016, and it's maintained at a sort of steady rate. Currently, last time I checked, which was a couple of days ago, it was at €1.13. So as you can see, that's dropped considerably. Now, this has a negative impact on outbound tourism because UK consumers are getting less foreign currency for their pounds. But it has made the UK a more attractive tourism destination for inbound tourism because foreign spending power has increased. So the exchange rate the pound has got weaker, and then I would refer to it as sort of spiced. Strong pound, imports cheaper, exports dearer, as a sort of go-to for exchange rate. So this has had a negative impact on tourism outside to leave the UK, to go on to holidays in Europe. But it has had a positive impact on the UK as a destination for foreign travellers. In terms of major businesses and niche operators, as I've mentioned, I'm not going to go through these in a huge amount of detail. I'm just going to focus on two examples in particular. Airlines are fairly clearly divided into low cost and high differentiation. Ryanair, Flybe, EasyJet, Norwegian are clearly low cost. You've got your high differentiation businesses, Emirates, British Airways, Virgin Atlantic, Etihad and Qatar. A number of the low cost airlines, just as an example of something that's changed, they've started to try and enter the long haul market. So for example, Norwegian Air's come onto the scene in the last few years, offering flights to New York from the UK for less than £300, which is significantly cheaper than what you would get from a high differentiation company. The main reason they've been able to do this is it's been much easier for them to get access to cheaper aircraft such as the Boeing Dreamliner, which has made that low-cost long-haul a real threat to the established long-haul companies, which are traditionally the highly differentiated businesses. The market for luxury airline travel is still strong though, and it's prompted huge investment because as there are quite a few businesses that operate within that market, there's a lot of innovation that must be done in order to make sure that they can create and maintain their competitive advantage. There's obviously a huge difference in terms of standard, in terms of priorities between the Ryanair flights and the Virgin Atlantic flights, just as an example. So I have flown with both this year. Last summer I went to California for 10 days to stay with a friend, and we flew Virgin Atlantic, and you obviously get good quality food, you get the DVD player with all the DVDs and the films and stuff you can watch. It's comfortable. I'm 6'5", so there's quite a lot of leg room in there, so I found myself quite comfortable. And then on the other hand, I flew with Ryanair I took my mum to Copenhagen for her 60th birthday in the Easter holidays. And we booked those flights because what we were looking for was the cheapest flights possible because there was about 4 of us going, and Ryanair was the best option. But the seats were hard, you were crammed in, you couldn't move the armrests, it wasn't comfortable, especially for someone like me where legroom is a really important factor. And we'll talk a little bit about Ryanair in a second, but they try and get you with the extra fees. Thomas Cook is probably one of the most prominent business examples that's been in the news over the last few years. They've had a really difficult few years, and especially difficult past month. So in May, they released their third profits warning of the last 12 months and announced losses of £1.45 billion. A lot of this they attributed to writing off a £1.1 billion acquisition of My Travel, but it's a massive issue for that company. Their chief executive said the prolonged heat wave last summer and high prices in the Canaries reduced customer demand for winter sun, particularly in the Nordic region, while there is now little doubt that the Brexit process has led many UK consumers to delay their holiday plans for this summer. So they've struggled with this quite extensively. Go into a little bit more detail about this. In order to ensure that their survival, since February 2019, they've been trying to sell off their airline, which apparently has a number of willing buyers, though none of those have come to fruition at the time of speaking. As you can see on the chart on the right, their share price has absolutely plummeted since this time last year. So you look at price in pence per share. If you look at the end of 2018 or mid 2018, they were at around 120, so £1.20 up to £1.40 towards the end of 2019. That's dropped massively, and at the last time I checked, which was only a couple of days ago, their shares were worth 19 pence per share. Now, that's terrible news for anyone who owns a lot of shares in Thomas Cook. It suggests that the business is, as it said, 3 profit warnings in the last 12 months and losses of 1.5 billion nearly. What it does suggest, though, is that there's potential opportunity for a takeover, because another business might see that the fact that the share value is so low, they might see that as an opportunity to buy shares while they're at their cheapest. I can't imagine they're going to get any smaller than this. Thomas Cook, of course, have been here before in 2013, and they were saved in no small part due to their CEO, Harriet Green, who sort of righted the ship before leaving in 2014. Ryanair boss, I'm going to talk about Ryanair in a second, Michael O'Leary, when he was asked about whether he was interested in buying the airline, he said that it is a dog. It's got some very old aircraft, all of which are leased. So there's a little bit of a mention towards the Boston Matrix there. So those products that have maybe a low market share in a low growth market. If that's his, maybe he was using it in a bit more of an uncomplimentary way. But that's something that's worth considering. Thomas Cook, again, if Thomas Cook comes up in the exam, you're going to get case study. So you would be able to answer the question effectively based on just what's in the case study. However, if you want a little bit more information or a little bit of background, I wouldn't go any further than this really. Have a look on some news articles. You'll see a ton of articles about what went wrong with Thomas Cook. They reckon that their airline is actually one of their potentially profitable areas, and that they're selling that because it has some value and will allow them to sort of subsidize the survival of their other parts of their business. So that's worth having a look at. The other business I'm going to focus on is Ryanair. So consumer body Which named Ryanair the UK's least liked short-haul airline for the 6th year in a row. Despite the fact that people don't like Ryanair, there was still a 7% increase in passenger numbers. And the way they manage this is because their average price is £37 per flight. They make their money through extra charges for pretty much everything else: luggage, meals, extra legroom, seats together. But the fact that their prices are low is what has led to them having an increase in passenger numbers. Like I say, I flew Ryanair only a couple of months ago, because what I was looking for and what a lot of people are looking for when they go into they look at the low cost providers, they're not too worried about the quality. The quality just needs to be acceptable, and acceptable quality for a flight is that it gets you there safely and there's a certain level of comfort. The priority is how much are you going to pay for your tickets, and if Ryanair tickets are £12 to £15 or £20 or £30 cheaper than the nearest competitor, they're obviously going to have that low cost advantage. That low cost, Porter's sort of strategy of competitive advantage and how a business should focus on either low cost or highly differentiation is hugely prominent within business. I think it's probably my most important theory within the A level specification. This is a really, really good example of that. We flew back from Copenhagen in April, and we went to do the check-in on my phone, and it was the first sort of maybe hour that check-in had been open, so all of the seats were pretty much available. And if you do it without paying the extra charges, they basically randomly assign you your seats. So I was there with my girlfriend, my brother, and my mum, and they put us in 4 seats that were one behind the other. Now, looking at the grid of all of the seats that were available, the rows were empty, so they could have easily just randomly assigned us 3 seats together. they deliberately, their algorithm sets it so that they deliberately assign you seats one behind the other, or just close enough that you're nearby but not next to each other, because then they'll charge you £4 each to move the seats to sit next to each other. So if I wanted to sit next to my family, I would have had to pay 12 quid, which doesn't sound like a huge amount, but obviously if you do that on 2 flights, that's £24. If you want extra legroom, that was £12 extra. And then obviously if you want extra luggage, you're looking at something like £40 to £20 per suitcase. So although the prices are low, the extras are what can drag the price up. So that's where they make their money. Now, some people will pay for that, and it will still be cheaper than alternatives. I wasn't willing to pay any, I'm not going to lie, I wasn't willing to pay any extra, so we all sat separately. When I got on the flight, I was in the seat behind my girlfriend, and as I was getting on, I gave her a book out of my bag, and the girl sat next to her, and the girl behind her, who was sitting in the seat next to where I was supposed to sit, they were together. Obviously my girlfriend and I were together, so they realised that they'd randomly been assigned the seats in front of it and behind each other as well, and so we just swapped. So it ended up working out okay. But it just goes to show what lengths Ryanair will go to try and encourage consumers to pay those little bits of extra money. Their focus has been on no frills, no business class, quick turnaround so they can get there as many flights as possible out each day, and most importantly low fares. And this growth has occurred primarily through the leadership of Michael O'Leary. He's ensured that the business focus solely on their low cost model. He's been described as a genius. He's not the most popular man because some of his ideas are fairly unpopular with consumers who want a decent standard of quality. So I think at one point he wanted to charge people to go to the toilet. One idea I think I heard from Ryanair was that they are looking into potentially having standing room on short haul flights. So I'm not quite sure how that would work. Presumably you'd need to sit down for the takeoff or the landing. I can't imagine you just strap yourself to a wall or just hold on tight. That's not going to really work. But it just goes to show the lengths that they'll go to sort of fill their capacity, to get as many people as is possible, because that's as many paying customers on each flight as possible. And with the quick turnarounds, get as many flights out as possible. So the last bit is the competitive environment. I'm not going to go through this into a huge detail. I've just got a couple of slides on this, and then I've got you a few little points to potentially go out and research yourselves. I've mentioned already the difference between low cost and high differentiation. I just want to do a little bit more on that. I listened to a short interview on BBC Sounds, A Turbulent Time for Low Cost Airlines, which I'll link as well. In recent months, quite a lot of low cost carriers have struggled with a couple of different things. There's been seasonality issues, they've had shortages of pilots and trained pilots, and they've had loss of key members of staff. This has really impacted on a business like Flybe, who've had multiple cancellations in April, which obviously has a huge impact on their brand image. Their CEO stood down recently in order to try and find new leadership to try and fix some of these issues. So that's had a massive impact on a low-cost operator such as Flybe. The low-cost airlines that have done well are the ones that have been able to benefit from economies of scale. Now Ryanair, they benefit from economies of scale because they buy their aircraft at once in bulk. And due to the fact that they're buying these aircraft in bulk, they're able to get a discount, and then therefore that obviously allows them to reduce they benefit from economies of scale, they get lower unit costs. Now, it takes quite a lot of effort to make an aircraft, so they tend to make the orders all at once, but have them delivered over maybe an 8 or 10 year period. The point is though, if they can buy in bulk, if they can buy maybe 100 aircraft instead of buying 5 aircraft, then that negotiation on price can be quite significant, because obviously aircraft are very, very expensive to make. Now Ryanair only make about $8 on average per passenger. So their profit margins per passenger aren't super high, but they fly 140 million passengers. So when you consider that, it makes a lot of profit. Consumers, as I've mentioned already, want the lowest costs, and so when they're looking for low-cost airlines, the businesses that keep their costs down are the inevitable winners in this market. Now, high differentiation comes in many forms. Doesn't just mean airlines. Obviously, I've talked a lot about airlines because it's the one that's the most easy to research, because it's obvious who the big brands are, whereas holiday providers can be very niche. And tourism boards, there's tons. There's ones for every different area, destination, different country. So differentiation comes in a number of different forms. I'm not going to give any real prominent examples, but just to talk a little bit about what differentiation is. Differentiation is having high quality, having unique features and attractions, or having something that can't be replicated elsewhere. So that is going to be a little bit easier in the niche markets, especially with those bespoke holiday providers. You think about businesses that offer safari tours and wildlife holidays, which we've already mentioned are increasing in popularity. The fact that they have that unique feature that, or something that can't be replicated elsewhere, is what is allowing them to increase their sales volume and as a result probably have high markups as well. It's much easier to chuck a premium price on something that is of a really high quality. So just make sure you know the difference between differentiation and low cost, and the benefits to being differentiated versus the benefits to being low cost, and obviously the drawbacks of those as well. I've got two other things that you might find worth researching in your own time over the next few days. If you feel like you want to do a little bit of research on these, have a little bit of a look at the importance of efficiency for airlines. There's a lot of focus on capacity utilization and making sure that their flights are full because of the incredibly high running costs for an airline. There's also quite a lot of focus on changing product portfolios. So businesses are moving away from expensive destinations towards trying to maybe get more capacity in short-haul, affordable destinations where they can effectively just lower their costs per passenger and increase their profit margins, especially in times where the holiday market is a little bit more challenging because of economic factors and income factors and so on. So I've talked quite a lot. I've got 37 minutes of information on the market. As I've stressed, and I will stress this one last time, the most important thing is that you know your key terms so that you're able to answer the questions and that you use the case studies effectively. Your objective is not to impress the examiner with all the research that you've done so that the examiner sits there and thinks, brilliant, this person's done tons and tons of research. What you really want to do is you want to make it as easy as possible for the examiner to give you marks. These examiners are marking hundreds of answers at a time potentially, or they're marking a lot of answers, and what they want to do is they want to give you the marks that you deserve, and they want to give them to you effectively and efficiently and quickly so that they can get through it. So don't feel like you need to impress the examiner with the research you've done. Impress the examiner with your knowledge of the course and your ability to apply it to the case studies. And then if there is a relevant point that you know about the market, then throw that in. But don't feel like you can just go in there with a bunch of data and completely ignore the case studies. The case studies are the most important part. If you've got any questions or so, just feel free to leave them as comments on this video, and I'll see what I can do in terms of getting back to them. They come to me in emails, as I have discovered over the last few weeks, when I've had about 7 or 8 of them a day asking me to do this video. So hopefully this has been what you were looking for. Good luck on the paper 3 exam. I hope that the other two have gone well as well. I think they've been okay so far. I don't like to make predictions, but one other thing I would sort of make a mention of with paper 3 as a sort of last point is you are likely to get an essay question, an extended essay question that involves the use of numbers. That might be interpretation of data, it might be calculations such as ratio analysis or investment appraisal, or maybe even a decision tree or something like that. So make sure that you're prepared for the numerical side as well, and you can use that information that you get from those calculations in an essay. So you don't just need to be able to do the calculations, you need to be able to explain what the figures actually say and whether they're good or bad. So make sure you're prepared for those as well. 10% of the marks at least on every paper have to be based on numerical quantitative skills, and so as a result you're going to get something that refers to it. And the clear prompt for this the question will start with using the data in extract whatever. Make sure you use the data. Make sure you figure out what calculations you can do or what data you can interpret, and make sure you use that. It obviously takes a little bit of time to do the calculations, and so as a result, once you've done the calculations, that should be your primary point. You might find something else in the case that you support it, but obviously it should make writing your points a little bit easier because you just need to interpret the figures that you've calculated. So the other thing I would just say is make sure you're up to date with your financial stuff as well and your numerical stuff. You should be, because you've already done paper 2. So as a result, you should have already practiced and revised all of this numerical stuff as well. But don't assume that now that you've just got essay questions, you're not going to get you're obviously not going to get a 4 marker, but you will still have to use these bits of data. So good luck, and then good luck for whatever you do next as well. And thanks for watching.